On a map of the world, the oil fields of the Persian Gulf do not appear as spectacular structures that would naturally draw the attention of the average observer because they do not take the form of monumental cities, skyscrapers, or ports, and yet it is precisely they, hidden beneath layers of sand, rock, and sediment, that constitute one of the most important foundations of the modern global economy, forming a system that operates without interruption, regardless of whether the world happens to be in a condition of stability or is entering a phase of mounting tension. What we see on the surface, terminals, refineries, tankers, is only a thin layer of infrastructure masking a far more complex reality, because the true value of the region lies deep underground, in deposits formed over millions of years, deposits that today determine not only the economies of the states of the region, but also political decisions, military strategy, and the broader balance of power across the world. Unlike many other energy regions where resources are dispersed and difficult to exploit, the Persian Gulf offers something that might fairly be described as a geological concentration of power, because the largest oil fields in the world are located relatively close to one another, creating a system that is at once highly efficient and highly vulnerable to disruption, which means that every element of this structure matters more than its physical scale alone would ever suggest. This is not merely a question of the sheer quantity of oil, impressive though that quantity undoubtedly is, but of the character of these deposits, which are relatively easy to exploit, meaning lower extraction costs, greater production flexibility, and an ability to respond rapidly to shifts in demand. And it is precisely this combination that allows the states of the region to function not only as suppliers of raw material, but as market regulators capable of influencing the price and availability of energy on a global scale. At the same time, however, this concentration of resources creates a paradox, because what constitutes the greatest strength of the region is also its greatest weakness, since the dependence of these economies on a single sector means that any disruption, whether arising from conflict, sanctions, or technological change, can produce consequences extending far beyond the borders of any individual state. In that context, oil fields cease to be merely places of extraction and become instead elements of strategic infrastructure requiring protection, management, and constant optimization, because their functioning cannot be disturbed without affecting the entire system, which is why around them there arise not only industrial installations, but also security systems, logistical networks, and political structures. When we look closely at the largest oil fields of the region, we begin to see that each of them performs a particular role within a wider system, because some are responsible for production stability, others for delivery flexibility, and still others for the ability to raise output rapidly in times of crisis, together forming a complex web of dependencies in which decisions taken in one place affect the functioning of the market as a whole. Nor can one ignore the fact that these fields are not only economic resources, but political instruments as well, because control over them means the ability to shape the behavior of other participants in the system, which is why they become objects of rivalry, negotiation, and, in extreme cases, conflict. Conflicts whose origins often lie not on the surface, but precisely within those concealed structures. It is also worth noting that the development of technology has not altered the fundamental significance of these deposits, but has only changed the way they are used, because modern methods of extraction, monitoring, and management allow resources to be exploited more efficiently, while at the same time increasing the dependence of the system on technological infrastructure, which itself becomes a potential point of vulnerability. At the same time, the global context in which these fields operate is changing, because the growing significance of renewable energy, pressure to reduce emissions, and shifts in demand structures mean that the role of oil is evolving, though it is not disappearing, which in turn means that the states of the region must adjust their strategies, balancing between the maximization of current revenues and preparation for a future in which their principal resource may lose part of its importance. Yet, despite all these changes, one thing remains constant: the scale and significance of the oil fields of the Persian Gulf which continue to serve as one of the pillars of the global energy system and whose functioning influences decisions taken by governments, corporations, and financial institutions throughout the world, which is why they cannot be analyzed in isolation from the wider geopolitical context. That is precisely why this episode will not be merely a description of individual deposits, but an attempt to understand the system as a whole. A system in which each oil field is an element of a larger structure, and in which its significance arises not only from the amount of crude extracted, but also from its role within the architecture of the global energy market. Because if we look at the Persian Gulf not as a geographical region, but as a mechanism, we begin to see that the oil fields are its core, the place where energy is transformed into power and natural resources into instruments of influence, which means that their analysis becomes a matter not only of economics, but of politics, security, and the future of the system as a whole. And it is precisely there that our story begins, not on the surface, where we see tankers and terminals, but deep underground, where the resources lie hidden, resources that have shaped the world for decades and whose significance, despite all changes, remains essential to any understanding of contemporary reality. If there is one place in the world that can be called the center of gravity of the global energy system, it is not any capital city, any port, or any commodity exchange, but the vast Ghawar oil field stretching beneath the surface of Saudi Arabia, functioning like a gigantic and almost invisible heart pumping crude into the system upon which the modern economy depends. At first glance, its scale is difficult to comprehend because Ghawar is not a single point on the map, but a structure extending across hundreds of kilometers, cutting through the desert and encompassing several segments which together form the largest conventional oil field in the world. And its significance does not derive merely from the size of its reserves, but from its ability to maintain stable, high production for decades. It is precisely that stability which gives Ghawar a role that cannot easily be replaced, because in a global system vulnerable to fluctuation, fixed points of reference are necessary, places that operate predictably and deliver a certain volume of crude regardless of changing conditions. And for years, Ghawar fulfilled exactly that function, serving as a foundation not only of the Saudi economy, but of global energy equilibrium. Yet what makes this field exceptional is not only its size, but also its geological character, because oil there is contained in formations that allow relatively easy extraction, which means lower costs and greater efficiency, and that in turn translates into Saudi Arabia's ability to respond to shifts in the market in ways that remain beyond the reach of many other producers. In practical terms, that means Ghawar is not merely a source of raw material, but an instrument for managing the market, because the ability to increase or reduce production gives Saudi Arabia influence over oil prices and therefore over the economies of importing states, which makes this field one of the most important elements of global energy politics. Yet Ghawar cannot be analyzed solely through the prism of its production potential, because equally significant are the challenges associated with its maintenance, since every oil field, regardless of size, is subject to the natural process of depletion, which means that in order to maintain output, increasingly advanced technologies become necessary, such as water injection or gas injection, allowing pressure in the reservoir to be maintained and its productive life extended. And it is precisely here that another dimension of Ghawar's significance appears, because its functioning is closely tied to the level of technological sophistication applied to it, which means that it is no longer just a natural resource, but a system requiring constant management, monitoring, and optimization, and every decision concerning its exploitation carries consequences extending far beyond production alone. At the same time, Ghawar is also an element of strategic infrastructure, which means that its security is treated as a priority, and around it, systems of protection are constructed to guard against both physical threats and potential attacks on infrastructure, because disruption to its functioning would have an immediate impact on the global energy market. It is also worth observing that the significance of Gawar is not static, because it changes with the evolution of the market and growing competition from other producers. The development of alternative energy sources and changes in demand patterns mean that its role must constantly be redefined, which in turn means that Saudi Arabia cannot rely solely on its potential but must also invest in broader economic diversification. Yet, despite these changes, one fact remains beyond dispute. Without Gawar, the modern energy system would look entirely different, because it was precisely this field that for decades provided the stability of supply upon which the development of many economies depended, and its influence on the world is far greater than might seem at first glance. More than that, Gawar is also the symbol of a certain era, an era in which oil was the unquestioned foundation of the economy, and states possessing the greatest reserves exercised the greatest influence over the global balance of power, which is why analyzing this field allows one to understand not only the present, but also the past and the possible future of the energy system. Because if we look at Gawar not as a single oil field, but as part of a larger mechanism, we begin to see that its significance arises not only from the amount of oil extracted, but from the role it has played in preserving the equilibrium that for decades defined the functioning of the global economy, an equilibrium whose disruption could produce consequences difficult to foresee. And that is precisely why Gawar is not merely a site of extraction, but a point of reference, an axis around which the entire system revolves, and its history is at the same time the history of a world that learned to function on the basis of energy drawn from deep within the earth, energy that still drives our cities, our industry, and our daily lives, even as we increasingly try to imagine a future in which its role may be smaller. If Gawar may be called the heart of the system, stabilizing its rhythm, then Bergen in Kuwait resembles the moment of its birth, the point at which energy hidden beneath the ground began to transform itself into statehood, institutions, and a modern economy, because it was precisely this field that served as one of the first signs that the Persian Gulf was not merely a geographical periphery, but the center of a future balance of power. Bergen did not arise as an element of an already existing system, but as one of its foundations because its discovery in the 1930s changed the trajectory of Kuwait's development almost immediately, transforming a small state with limited resources into one of the most important players in the oil market, demonstrating how a single deposit can define the future of an entire country. Unlike Gawar, which for decades served as a stabilizer of the market, Bergen was from the beginning a symbol of intense growth because its exploitation made possible the rapid expansion of production and the generation of revenues that became the basis for the construction of infrastructure, educational systems, and administration. In other words, everything that composes a modern state. That is exactly why Bergen is more than an oil field, because it stands as an example of how natural resources can be transformed into political and social capital, though at the same time it also reveals the limits of that model, because dependence on a single sector creates risks that become visible in moments of crisis. One of the most dramatic moments in Bergen's history came during the Gulf War in the early 1990s. When retreating Iraqi forces set hundreds of oil wells on fire, causing one of the greatest environmental catastrophes in the history of the energy industry, while at the same time demonstrating just how vulnerable energy infrastructure is to military action. The images of burning wells, smoke rising above the desert, and black rain falling over surrounding areas became symbols not only of destruction, but also of the fragility of a system that appears stable only until it is truly tested, which is why Bergen also remains a reminder that energy and security are inseparably linked. Despite that destruction, the field was rebuilt and returned to operation, which demonstrates the system's capacity for regeneration, while also revealing how great the required resources must be, financial, technological, and organizational, in order to sustain such a system, which in practice means that only a small number of states are truly capable of managing structures of this scale effectively. From a geological perspective, Bergen belongs among the most productive deposits in the world, which means that its exploitation is relatively cheap and efficient, and that in turn allows Kuwait to maintain a competitive position on the market even in periods of falling oil prices, making the field one of the pillars of the country's economic stability. At the same time, however, Bergen, like other great fields, faces the challenge of resource depletion, which means that maintaining production levels requires ever more advanced technologies and management strategies, which in turn raise both the cost and the complexity of operations, thereby changing the way the state understands its own resources. It is also worth noting that Bergen plays an important regional role because its production affects the balance of supply in the Persian Gulf and therefore influences decisions taken by other states in the region, which means that it is not an isolated element of the system, but part of a much larger web of interdependence. At the same time, the way Bergen is viewed by the outside world is changing because growing pressure for energy transition means that fields such as this are becoming the subject not only of economic debate, but also of environmental debate, which means that their future no longer depends only on the resource itself, but also on political and social decision-making. Yet, despite those changes, Bergen remains one of the most important reference points in the global energy system because its history shows how energy can transform a state, and its continued functioning reminds us that this process is never complete, but requires continuous adjustment to changing conditions. Because if we look at Bergen not as an oil field but as a story of transformation, we begin to see that it is a story not only about oil, but also about power, risk, and the capacity to survive, a story that is still unfolding and that continues to shape the reality of the region and of the wider world. If Gawar is the heart hidden beneath the desert, and Bergen the symbol of a state's birth, then Safania is proof that the boundaries of the energy system do not end on land, because the largest offshore oil field in the world lies not beneath sand, but beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, where extraction infrastructure operates under conditions that are far more demanding, yet no less critical for the global market. Safania does not resemble the classic oil field that one might visualize as a set of wells and installations scattered across a desert, because its structure is dispersed and stretched beneath the sea, where platforms, pipelines, and transport systems create a complex network that must function in an environment vulnerable to weather shifts, corrosion, and limited operational accessibility. It is precisely this specificity that makes Safania something more than just another source of oil, because it is an example of a system adapting itself to conditions that require greater precision, technology, and coordination, and every operation must be planned with factors in mind that matter less on land, such as sea currents, depth, or the availability of service infrastructure. At the same time, however, the scale of the field means that despite these challenges, its significance for Saudi Arabia and for the wider region remains enormous, because offshore production constitutes an important complement to onshore extraction, increasing the flexibility of the system and allowing for diversification of sources, which in practice means greater resilience against disruption. Unlike land-based fields, which are often seen as more stable, Safania introduces an element of variability into the system, because offshore operations are more vulnerable to disturbance, meaning that managing the field requires not only technology, but also the capacity to respond rapidly to unforeseen situations, making it one of the most demanding components of the entire infrastructure network. At the same time, the development of offshore technology has made fields such as Safania an integral part of the global energy system because they make accessible resources that were once beyond reach, meaning that the boundaries of extraction have shifted from land to sea, and with them, the structure of the market itself has changed. It is also worth noting that Safania plays an important strategic role, because maritime infrastructure is harder to protect than land-based installations, which means that its security requires different solutions, such as naval patrols, maritime traffic monitoring, and cooperation with armed forces, all of which increase the complexity of the entire system. At the same time, however, the presence of such fields at sea increases the strategic significance of control over maritime spaces because access to offshore resources is directly tied to shipping security and regional stability, which means that Safania becomes not merely an element of the energy system, but part of a broader geopolitical puzzle. Nor can one ignore the fact that offshore exploitation carries greater environmental risk because any failure may produce serious consequences for marine ecosystems, which means that managing such a field requires not only efficiency, but responsibility as well, something that in practice translates into additional costs and tighter regulation. Despite these challenges, Safania remains one of the pillars of Saudi oil production because its ability to deliver large quantities of crude makes it an indispensable element of a system that must function regardless of conditions, which is why it stands among the most technologically advanced oil fields in the world. More than that, Safania shows that the future of oil extraction does not remain confined to traditional methods, but increasingly involves complex operations requiring the integration of technology, logistics, and management, which means that the energy system is becoming ever more dependent on knowledge and innovation. Because if we look at Safania not simply as an oil field, but as a system functioning under extreme conditions, we begin to see that its significance arises not only from the quantity of crude produced, but from its role in extending the limits of what is possible within the contemporary energy industry. And that is precisely why Safania is not merely another part of the puzzle, but proof that the energy system of the Persian Gulf continues to develop, adapt, and extend its boundaries, which means that analyzing it requires not only attention to the present, but also to a future in which the sea may play an ever greater role in delivering energy to the world. When we place Ghawar, Bergen, and Safania beside one another, we cease to look at them as three separate oil fields and begin to see a system almost organic in character, one in which each element performs a specific function and whose full significance becomes visible only in relation to the others, because only their interaction creates the effect that for decades has powered the global economy. Ghawar functions as a stabilizer, a point of reference for a market that for years relied on it to maintain predictability in a world vulnerable to fluctuation. Bergen reminds us of the origins of this power, of the moment when oil ceased to be merely a resource and became the foundation of statehood, the source of institutions, infrastructure, and entire social models. Safania, by contrast, points toward the future development of the system, shifting its boundaries from land to sea and introducing a new level of technological and operational complexity. Together, they form a structure that might be called an architecture of energy, one extended both geographically and functionally, because it encompasses not only sites of extraction, but an entire chain of dependencies, from geology through technology, logistics, and security, all the way to politics and finance, which means that each of these fields is at once a distinct element and part of a larger arrangement in which decisions taken at one point resonate throughout the system. It is precisely this capacity for resonance that gives the oil fields of the Persian Gulf significance extending far beyond the region, because their functioning affects energy prices, the stability of economies, investment decisions, and state strategies, which means that they are among the very few elements of the contemporary world that exert direct influence both on the macroeconomic level and on the daily lives of millions of people. At the same time, however, this power is inseparable from fragility, because a system built upon concentration of resources is by nature vulnerable to disruption, and every field, regardless of size, may become a critical point whose destabilization produces a domino effect, which means that the security of energy infrastructure becomes one of the central challenges of contemporary geopolitics. In that context, Ghawar, Bergen, and Safania cease to be merely extraction sites and become elements of strategic infrastructure requiring continuous protection, monitoring, and management, because their functioning cannot be disturbed without consequences for the entire system, which means that around them there arise not only physical systems of security, but also invisible political and financial structures. At the same time, the environment in which these fields operate is changing because the global energy transition is introducing new tensions and new questions about the future of oil, which means that their significance is not disappearing but evolving, and the states of the region must therefore balance between maximizing current advantage and preparing for a world in which their main resource may cease to be the dominant source of energy. That does not mean, however, that the role of these fields is diminishing in a linear fashion because even under scenarios of energy transition, oil remains a key component of the system and its significance changes over time more than it vanishes, which is why analysis of these deposits remains essential not only for understanding the past and present, but the future as well.